Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization. It is April 26th, 2021. Today the topic is going to be why sovereignty matters. And to look at this, we're going to go back in history a few hundred years to the end of the 30 Years' War, which raged from 1618 to 1648. An incredibly destructive war. It was a battle partly between religions, partly between different empires, and the results were the destruction of many of the parishes of Europe, slaughter, pillaging. It was a horrible time, and they actually took about 7 years to reach a peace settlement. 2 years were involved in the final peace, which was called the Peace of Westphalia. It was negotiated in two different cities, Osnabrück and Münster. Now, the question of sovereignty emerged when they were signing an agreement to end the war. And the agreement included the following points, which are principles of sovereignty which remained at the core of nation-state relationships to the present day. One, that each prince would have the right to determine the religion of his state. Secondly, those living in a state with a different established religion were given the right to practice their religion. It was somewhat of a freedom of religion, not entirely. And then the third point, and this is the most important, I think, the inviolability of borders and non-interference in the domestic affairs of other sovereign states. Now, this put an end to the destruction of the 30 Years' War. There continued to be warfare because you still had empires. You still had different opinions as to what should be the distribution of wealth, of trade, various other kinds of issues. But underlying it was this general accepted idea of sovereignty. Now this, of course, was developed much further by the American Revolution, which established the principle that a sovereign nation must be concerned with the general welfare of its population. Now, this whole concept was attacked definitively in the period 1999 to 2004. Not surprisingly, the author of the anti-sovereign doctrine was none other than Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The same Tony Blair who convinced the Bush administration, or worked with the Bush administration, to launch the endless wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And in particular in Iraq on the phony lie, or the fabricated lie, that there were weapons of mass destruction that Saddam had. Now, in his 2004 speech, Tony Blair said the following. He justified the concept of a preventive war in a post-Westphalian world. He said that we're going to put an end to the system of nation states. This is no longer an acceptable basis because you cannot sit by while some states violate the human rights of the people who live in those states. Now, this was originally put forward by him in 1999 in a speech in Chicago, in which he proclaimed that military intervention by NATO anywhere in the world was justified, based on this idea to stop the destruction carried out by sovereign governments against their own people. But in March 5th, 2004, in Sedgefield, England, Blair proclaimed the end of the Westphalian Order. And he said it really ended with 9/11. Now, he specified the Westphalian Order says you don't interfere in internal affairs unless you are threatened. But he said, what changed? What happens when your values are threatened? So why do we need a new order? To prevent such a threat to your values from materializing. In other words, you intervene before the threat goes against your own order, against your own values, And he says that there is concern about this. People don't want to leave the Westphalian Order. Why? He said there is concern that the U.S. and its allies will, by sheer force of their military might, do whatever they want unilaterally and without recourse to any rule-based code or doctrine. That's precisely what happened. That's what the so-called rule-based order that was brought in with Blair's announcement. And then he lays out the real purpose of the change and what should be done to enforce it. And this is a quote. He says, Britain's role is to try to find a way through this. That is, to make it not seem as though it's a unilateral world order based on military might. And he said the way you do this is to construct a consensus behind a broad agenda of justice and security and the means of enforcing it. And then he said you must reform international institutions to conform with this new 21st century reality so we can act to spread our values. And here's how he concluded. How do you do that? How do you reform the institutions to protect our values? It is a new type of war. It will rest on intelligence to a greater degree than ever before. It demands a different attitude toward our own interests. It forces us to act even when so many comforts seem unaffected and the threat so far off, if not illusory. What's the key here? Intelligence. The use of propaganda. That is, the intelligence agencies develop the justification for war. Propaganda, use of false flags. And to protect which values? The values of the central banks which defend the interests of the private banks, to protect their looting rights. This is a defense of the City of London and Wall Street, which at that time were already pushing for a global order where no sovereign state could refuse to submit to that order. And if necessary, military means would be used to enforce it. So what are the values? The self-proclaimed democratic values? Well, the end of national sovereignty had been in the sights for a long time, going back to the end of World War II. The argument that nationalism was the cause of two wars. No, it wasn't. The cause of the two wars was British geopolitical thinking, the defense of the empire. But you had documents, for example, Walt Wriston, the head of Citibank, which was one of the institutions that did the most to destroy banking regulation in the United States. In 1992, Wriston published a book called The Twilight of Sovereignty. And then probably the most important for the establishment of this responsibility to protect doctrine was Samantha Power, who's now the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development under Biden, who was UN ambassador under Obama. In 2002, she wrote a book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, in which she put forward the responsibility to protect. Now, what was done under this doctrine? Iraq, the invasion of Iraq on false pretenses, and the destruction of the country and mass murder in Iraq. The destruction of Libya under false pretenses. The bombing of the country, the arming of jihadist militants, and the murder of Gaddafi. Ukraine, the overturning of a legitimately elected government by forces tied to NATO, to George Soros, and run by Biden and Victoria Nuland. And Victoria Nuland in 2014 was on the scene. Today she's appointed number 3 in the State Department. And then Syria. All of these were cases where supposedly our values were threatened, so much so that we had to arm what? Militant jihadist terrorists. Do they represent Western values? Do you see the hypocrisy in this? And now they're targeting Russia and China. And let me give you a hint of what's coming. The London Economist, in their April 24th issue, had a cover story titled Putin's Next Move. Russian president menaces his people and neighbors. The West should raise the cost of his malign behavior. The London Economist is the journal of the City of London banks of the British Empire, and they're calling for an escalation against Russia. And the solution they propose, raising the costs, new sanctions, including shutting down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which includes sanctions against Germany, which needs the fuel that they would get from Russia with the Nord Stream 2. Escalate financial sanctions. use international financial transactions and the shutting down of the transforming or transferring currencies from bank to bank, from country to country, stop it from the Russians, take away their ability to borrow money, prevent other countries or investors from buying Russian bonds. Now, The Economist argues that Biden so far, quote, has made a good start, unquote. And they say now Biden must allow for defensive weapons to get to Ukraine and beef up the NATO presence in the Black Sea. And what's the latest story? That Russia is using microwave weapons against U.S. soldiers in the Middle East, according to the Pentagon. False flag, more sanctions, threat for regime change. That's the policy. The person who initiated this in the modern period, or who was the front man for it, was Tony Blair, who's proven to be an agent of these City of London, Wall Street banks, as has, up to this point in time, U.S. President Joe Biden. So this is the issue with the sanctions and the attacks against Syria, against Iran, but also against Russia and China. Because these countries, especially Russia and China, have the economic and military power to resist a global world order run as a central banker dictatorship. And that's why they're being targeted under the so-called responsibility to protect doctrine. And that's what you need to know next time you hear someone spouting off against Russia and China. They're actually doing the dirty work for the City of London and the globalist bankers who are prepared to commit mass murder to defend their system.